I live in a small village and the nearest place where I can get some art supplies is Lidl. I already bought watercolors in tubes, watercolor pencils, and not long ago I bought watercolor markers. And I thought for my Christmas video number 7, I painted the same thing to see how they look like, just to see the difference. I decided to make these cards. I painted a background with very simple berries, sort of a cross between holly and mistletoe. I just did not want to make the leaves too complicated. I'm going to start with the watercolor markers, which is my latest purchase. At least it was when I made this video. I also bought watercolor crayons since then, so there will have to be another video in the future. The watercolor markers come in a pack of 8, and each marker is double-sided. One side has the typical round nib, and the other side has a brush nib. To make it easier to paint the berries, to create the circles, I did this watercolor stamping technique. I took a lid that fit the size, it's from another marker. I applied the paint over the edge of the lid. I also used a water brush pen to make the marker paint more fluid. And then I stamped it on top of my cardstock. I did this only for the bigger berries, the smaller ones I painted freehand. This is just to make the circle shape easier. Of course, you could freehand all of it. After I stamped the circles, I took the marker and filled the circle. I also left a little bit of white for the highlight. However, you could also use a white gel pen or gouache after the berries are dry. Then I took a water brush pen. You could also use a normal brush and water, and I went over the circle. The water activates the paint and makes it more smoother. I also covered the highlight, but this is what I wanted. Also, these markers can be used without any water, just like you would use alcohol markers, but for that I probably would need more shades of each color, at least one darker and one lighter. I painted the berries mainly in clusters of 3 or 2, but there are also some single berries with 2 leaves. When it comes to the leaves, I didn't want to do anything too complicated, so I painted very simple leaves. You could also try painting the holly leaves because this is supposed to be a holly, but I find them a bit difficult, and I wanted to make this quick and easy. The amount of leaves you paint is completely up to you. On my background, some clusters of berries have 5 leaves, some have 3, and the single berries have 2 leaves. This background is very simple and the painting is straightforward, so I already sped up the video quite a bit. This way you can see the whole painting process, but I will be slowing it down when needed. The main background is finished, and even though there are not too many big white spaces, I still decided to fill off some of the white spaces with very light single leaves. To make the color lighter using markers, I just scribbled the paint on an acrylic block, anything slick will do, and I just picked a little bit of paint on the tip of my brush. I also wanted to add a little bit of splatter. This is something I really like to do. So I scribbled the marker again, and this time I added a little bit of water using a normal brush, and I splattered the paint over the background. So the background is done. I will show you how I assemble the card at the end of this video. Let's move on to the next background using normal watercolor paints. These are tube paints and come in a big box of 24. I actually threw the box away and I just put them into a plastic container. I picked red and green paint and I squeezed them onto a palette. I did here exactly the same as on the previous card. I used the lid of a marker and stamped the big circles. And then I filled them with the paint. Here I'm using normal brushes. I started with a number 8 round brush, but then I switched to size 4. I just found it much easier to use. I keep these watercolors in tubes and only squeeze them out when I'm painting. I did try making a palette where you squeeze the paints and let them dry. This might work with more expensive paints, but it did not work with these ones. Later I actually did hear some watercolor artists mentioning that this doesn't work with cheap paints, and that was sort of my aha moment because the dried paint doesn't stick to the palette and also the paint is not as vibrant. I guess it is better to keep the paints in the tubes and only squeeze them out when you're using them. I haven't mentioned the paper yet. While I do have watercolor paper from Lidl, here I'm using watercolor paper from Flying Tiger. This is also a cheap watercolor paper, but it's much better than the one from Lidl, especially because it's 300 grams, while the one from Lidl is only 190. So the background with the watercolors is done. Let's move on to the last background where I used watercolor pencils. There are 24 pencils in this box, plus a brush, but the brush is not as great, at least not for the painting. Here I could not put the color on the lid, but since these are pencils, it was easy to create an outline by tracing the lid. Except of the circle drawing, I did the same thing as on the other backgrounds, especially on the background with the markers. I filled the circle with color and then with a water brush I activated the paint and smoothened it out. What I like about watercolor pencils is the control I have. I mainly use them when I'm coloring, and compared to watercolors, the application is much easier. Although where they are not as good is layering. This probably only applies to cheap watercolor pencils. I don't have any expensive brand for comparison, but I have another cheap brand of watercolor pencils, the budget option from Faber-Castells, and there I had difficulty to layer. With the Lidl pencils, I didn't test it, but I've seen other artists that mentioned it. And overall, not being able to layer, for me, that's not a big deal. You can also see that compared to watercolors and watercolor markers, the color of the pencils is pretty light. However, I did not really mind, I really like the result. It reminds me an old-fashioned wallpaper. I finished up the background. I forgot to mention also with the other watercolor panels, if you are painting a pattern like this, don't forget to paint, in this case, berries and leaves along the edges of your watercolor panel. Otherwise, it might look empty. If it does look like that and you already removed the washi tape, place it back and paint additional berries. I also added a few of the single leaves in the white spaces, and here I decided not to add any splatter. So the backgrounds are done, and here are the finished cards. The first one is painted with the markers, the second one with the normal watercolors, and the third one is painted with the pencils. For all of them, the greeting I printed out and fussy cut. I used the Swedish greeting, Gott Jul, which means Good Christmas. Here we can see all the cards together. The main difference is the vibrancy of the color. Overall, I like all the products. Are they the best? Of course not, but they are very cheap. And I will definitely use all of them again in the future together with my new watercolor crayons. And if you would like to see more Christmas ideas, check out my videos from previous years. The links to those videos will be in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in my next video.